Hello and welcome to Magda Knits. My name is Magda and I'm coming to you from the southeast of England, and this is my little space where I talk about all of my knitting, yarn spinning and fibre dyeing. I hope you will enjoy this episode. It hasn't been that long since I recorded last. Normally there is a bit of a longer break, but today we've got nice weather, I'm off work, and I felt like today is a good day to record, especially that I have two finished objects to share. I have a couple of whips, I finished some yarn, and yeah, didn't want to accumulate too many things. So hopefully this one is not going to be as long as I normally make my episodes. Fingers crossed. I hope it's also not going to be too loud. The farmer is plowing the fields. He is literally next to our house, so it can be a bit noisy, but if it is too loud, I'll stop the recording and wait a little bit. The plowing season is upon us, and that is a great opportunity for me to take pictures and photographs the birds. We live in an area where we have plenty of red kites, which are magnificent birds, and we're so lucky to have them literally on our doorstep. So I will insert the footage just to show you a little bit of how many of them there are. Although this year I feel like there's slightly less of them around, and I'm not entirely sure why. Whether it has anything to do with the very hot summer that we had. But nevertheless, yeah, there's still plenty of them around, and it's just so lovely to watch them. They literally follow the tractors. They look like birds of prey, but they are not really great hunters. They feed mostly on roadkill and they're just basically scavengers, but they love to eat all those little bugs and worms that come out from the ground when the fields are being plowed. So we've got plenty of them right now. So I hope you enjoyed this little footage. Normally I would insert it at the end, but I think it just makes more sense to insert the video while I'm talking about it. But anyway, this is a knitting podcast, so let's dive into the knitting content. And first I would like to show you my first finished object, which is the one that I'm wearing, and this is the Wild Posy by Melody Hoffmann, which I have knitted in the Plotolopi yarn, and I have completed this just a few days ago. It was supposed to be completed much quicker because it actually is a very quick knit, but I have decided to do a lot of spinning in the meantime, and also after I finished the body of the sweater, it was actually sitting in a naughty corner for a while because at that point I wasn't particularly happy with what I was seeing, but I will talk about it all in a minute. First, let's focus on how this sweater is constructed. So it is a top-down construction. You are knitting in the round, and obviously you start with casting on here around the neckline, and then you are starting to increase the body, and you are knitting all this lovely textured design that you've got here on the yoke. Melody Hoffmann provides two versions of this sweater, and it's available within one PDF download. You have the Luna and the Flora version. This is the Luna version, which means that you are adding all those little textured bits here, whereas in the Flora version you've got like a little lace work instead. Really lovely pattern, very well written, by the way. So Melody provides links to different bits around the yoke. So obviously if you are thinking about those wrap stitches here, if you haven't made these before, you can watch the video and familiarize yourself with how to knit them. However, her written instructions are so good that I didn't even have to look at the videos. I was able to figure it out from the actual written instructions. So I think this really means that the pattern is really well written, at least in my opinion. So yeah, whether you are more of a visual person, you can obviously go for the links, but the instructions themselves are really good. So I found this to be a great pattern. After you finish with the yoke, then obviously you split for the sleeves, and then you just knit the body. What I decided to do with this pattern is I decided to add a bit of waist shaping. So I was touching on this in my previous episodes where I was talking about the fact that my sweaters, which are knitting around, especially the ones that have a circular yoke, they tend to have a bit of a weird fit at the back. I was trying to figure it out by perhaps moving the stitches around, as in when you are splitting for the sleeves. With some of my previous projects I decided, or with one of my previous projects, I decided to move the place where you divide for the stitches to accommodate or to prevent the excess fabric to appear at the back of my sweaters, but that didn't seem to work very well because as a result I ended up with more fabric at the front, which wasn't a great fit. So I decided that I wanted to actually try and do a little bit of waist shaping and prevent that tent to appear at the back of my sweater, and actually I must say it pretty much worked out. I don't know if it is thanks to the waist shaping or whether the overall fit of this sweater is just different to the previous ones, but as a result I don't really have any excess fabric at the back. I will stand up and show you how the sweater fits. I'm not sure whether I will have time to take proper pictures of this sweater before I release this video, so I'm not sure if you will. If I do, then you will be able to see the image of the overall fit in the corner here. But if not, I will stand up in a minute to show you the back, but I also want to show you something else, and I don't kind of want to spoil anything and get ahead of myself by just showing you the whole garment just yet. But anyway, yes, so I added some waist shaping. I can't remember how many stitches I decreased. What I did is I decreased one stitch on each side, and I think I've done it 5 times in total. So in total I actually decreased 10 stitches. This is a very oversized sweater, I think, or it is designed to be a bit oversized. I don't tend to wear my sweaters with as much positive ease, so I felt like I really had enough room to decrease those stitches. After I was done with the decreases, then as I hit my natural waistline, then I started increasing to accommodate space for the hips. So it is a bit of a shape created with the fabric, but you can't quite see it really. You don't see like this, hourglass shape. It's not as dramatic and it's not tight fitting anyway to give you this kind of illusion. But I think it really did help with the overall shaping. So I feel like going forward, I would like to add shaping to my waist, just to help with the overall fit of the sweater. After you're done with the body, then you are doing a 1x1 ribbing, and then you're binding off. I'm not entirely sure how long the sweater was supposed to be. I very rarely follow the instructions about the length. I usually just try the sweater on and then I just decide to bind off when I feel like this is the right length for me. Having said that, very often I actually bind off too quickly because I get too impatient. This is something that Nikki from the Knitting with Cat Hair mentioned in her previous episode, that yeah, when it comes to body, I'm the same like her. I just get really impatient and I just kind of try it on. I look at the overall fit and I'm thinking, yeah, this is enough. And it isn't. It very often isn't. Yeah, I think it's just the desire to have the finished object. But yeah. Anyway, this length of this sweater is actually okay. I persevered. I didn't make it too short. I think I like the length of the garment. But yeah, the binding off. Oh gosh. So you are knitting this with Plötulopi, or I knitted this with Plötulopi. You can knit it with any other yarn that you really wish, but Plötulopi is an unspun yarn. This was the first time I was actually knitting with an unspun yarn, and I'll talk about my experience in a minute, but when it comes to the binding off, oh dear. I did watch many podcasts before, and I have seen people knitting with Plotalopi or Nutiden or just generally unspun yarn, and everyone is talking about the same thing. Tubular bind off with this yarn is tricky. So I knew it beforehand, but for some reason, so I started the bind off, the tubular bind off, and you know, I was doing it very slowly, very delicately, and it was working out. It was working out really well for quite some time. I think I was nearly halfway through with binding off the body when things started to go a bit downhill, because the more you pull the yarn through those loops, the more weaker it gets. You know, it gets thinner and thinner because with every pull, each of those individual strands, it kind of get caught in those stitches, and you just end up with a thinner and thinner yarn, and eventually it just starts breaking. So I was trying to do the spit splice, and it would kind of work for a while, but eventually as you keep pulling, things start to split and divide and break again. So it was getting really frustrating towards the end. So what I decided to do as a result, I just broke the yarn, and whatever I had left, I just ran it through my wheel, attached the bit with the split splice, and then just carried on binding off. But by adding that twist, obviously I reinforced this string of yarn, and it was much easier to finish. So next time I do it, I will definitely do, I will add a little bit of twist. You can potentially, like if you don't have a spinning wheel, you could just add twist yourself by just twisting the yarn and just adding a bit more strength to it. Having said that, I did not do it for the sleeves. So with the sleeves, I figured because it's much less fabric, I figured the yarn wouldn't have enough time to weaken itself that much. And that was true. I was able just to do a regular bind off or a regular tubular bind off without doing any extra bits, and it did not break. So that was fine. But on the body, you have so much fabric, you have so much pulling, so many stitches that it didn't work. And yeah, so after you're done with the body, then you pick up the sleeves. You are doing decreases, and you end up with adding a little bit of decoration, if you like, with the wrapped stitches just before the cuff, and then again one by one ribbing to finish it off with the tubular bind off. Of course, you could do any other bind off. I like the look of tubular bind off. It just creates a very neat finish, and I think it just adds enough stretch. I think it's a perfect balance between not having anything flaring but also having things nice and snug. And yeah, it's just a nice nice finish. So let's talk about what did not work with this sweater. So I think maybe at this point I can start moving around. I was trying not to move too much so that you don't spot what actually happened, but the problem that I have with this fit of this sweater is that the length of the yoke is just too deep. So as I lift my arms, perhaps on the video you can't really see the problem as much, but what I can tell you is that my true armpit is actually here. So you've got quite a lot of excess fabric, and it is pulling in a very uncomfortable way. So as I lift my arms, my sleeves are pulling in, so I end up with something being way too short, at least for my liking. I know that some people tend to knit their sleeves this length, but I hate it. Like, I really like my sleeves to be much longer. And also it just pulls like the whole sweater up. It just is way too deep. So I ideally would have started splitting the sleeves much quicker. Actually, if I was to follow the pattern exactly, I would have the yoke even deeper than this. But I have realized at one point that this is just going to be too long, and if you look closely, you may notice that the last bit of wrapped stitches is actually really closely located to those textured stitches here in the middle. You are not supposed to knit it like this. There is supposed to be more of a stockinette between the textured and wrapped stitches, as I have here. I don't know if it's that much visible, but yeah, this should just a little bit lower, and then you split for the sleeves. But that would create even more fabric here in the armpits, and that would just be a complete disaster altogether. So yeah, it was all because of the row gauge. So just to make it clear, it is not the fault of the pattern, it's entirely my fault, and it is actually going back to the issue that I was talking about in my previous episode when I was knitting my Lenore cardigan, which ended up being very, very long, much longer than I intended it to be. One of the culprits was the yarn, which was alpaca blend and it stretched, but also it was my row gauge. And here it was exactly the same story. Oh, yarn, sorry. So this yarn, it's got loads of like really thick individual strands of fiber that just keep coming out of this sweater. It's a bit of a nightmare when you're knitting with it because we've got a black sofa, and after I would be done with knitting, it would just look as if a cat was sitting in there because it would just have hair all over it. Yeah, a bit annoying. But anyway, what was I talking about? I was talking about the row gauge. Yes, so when I finished my Lenore, and after it grew, and after I figured out that one of the main reasons for it not to fit was my row gauge, I decided to be a bit more mindful of that in my future projects, but at that point I was already really deep into this yoke. And then I decided to measure my gauge, and I figured I was way, way, way off. I can't remember how much off I was, but it was something quite ridiculous. I can't remember what the original pattern was calling for. It might have been like 22 rows or 25, and I ended up with like, maybe it was 25 rows and I had like 19. It was a huge difference. So when you are following the pattern, and in this case, I guess because it is a really thick yarn, I don't know if that works out to like worsted weight or iron weight, but the stitches are quite big. And I think a difference of like even one row or two is making a massive effect on the overall fit or the overall length of the garment. I am mostly used to knitting with fingering weight yarn, maximum like DK. So I'm not very familiar with anything thicker than that. And I now I got a little bit discouraged from knitting with thicker yarn because I feel like, you know, being off just a little bit, it really makes a huge difference on the whole sweater. So if you are to follow and have the yoke exactly as it was designed with all those bits in, you know, in the texture here in the design, you either have to change something or you're just going to end up with something really long, in my case, because I was completely off the gauge. So yeah, that was a little bit disappointing. And I couldn't figure out how it could be fixed, because if I was to knit tighter, I would be changing the gauge of my stitches at the same time. And I was perfectly on the gauge when it comes to the count of my stitches. So yeah, it was just a little bit disappointing. So yeah, so the overall fit of the sweater is really not... I'm not really happy with it. I guess maybe now I can stand up just to show you how it sits on the body, how long it is. So let me just get up. Yeah, I don't think you can really see the waist shaping much when I keep my arms like this. Maybe a little bit, but you can definitely see the fabric in my armpits making all sorts of weird stuff. This is the length, which falls right on my hips, but if I lift my arms, you just, yeah, the whole thing just shifts a lot. And yeah, the back of the sweater, there is no tent. Normally I would end up with like something like this really sticking out and being really pronounced, but here that excess fabric, somehow it just really nicely wraps the body, and there is nothing really standing out and poking out. So yeah, that side of the fit was actually really good. Yeah, so I don't know, I feel like this is going to be another sweater which I will only wear at home, because I would feel a little bit uncomfortable and very self-conscious to wear it out. But nevertheless, I really enjoyed knitting on this project. It was a super quick knit. I have knitted the sleeves, literally it took me like half a day per sleeve, so that was such a quick knit. I guess that's the good thing about thick yarn, although I do feel a little bit discouraged. And yeah, it was a fun design, which I think I would like to knit again. And I think I would like to knit it in Plötulopi again. I'm just not entirely sure how I would solve the issue of the excess fabric in here. Perhaps I could modify the pattern somehow to start splitting earlier and still somehow continue with the design on the yoke. Or maybe I could, or maybe what I could do is I could completely skip that bit here and then start splitting around here. So just after the last wrap stitches, I could just do plain stockinette and start splitting for the sleeves. So that could actually solve that issue, because I still love the design, I still love the look of this sweater, and yeah, I would like to have it knitted successfully. So watch this space, I might do it again. Especially that I really enjoyed working with Plötulopi. So as I mentioned, this was the first time I was working with Handspun yarn, so it was a completely new experience to me, but it was lovely. I was holding this yarn double, just to, you know, get the gauge. But I think this also obviously strengthened the fiber, so it wasn't breaking as much. I think if I was knitting with a single strand, maybe it would break a little bit more. But I did not break anything at all. I broke it once, but that's purely because I just accidentally sat on the yarn, and then I took my knitting and pulled, and then it just went. But yeah, you just have to be careful. But the overall experience was very pleasant. I love the look of this fabric. I don't know what it is about Handspun yarn. It just, those stitches look so fuzzy and lovely, and yeah, I love it. So I definitely will knit much more with Handspun yarn in the future. I do like the feel of it. It's not the softest yarn, I guess, so if you are sensitive, perhaps it would be a little bit itchy, but I guess my tolerance towards itchiness is quite high. And yeah, like I'm wearing a vest underneath, but like the fabric here is touching my skin, and like I don't have any long sleeve underneath, so it's touching my skin as well, and I don't feel itchy. It's completely fine, and it's definitely super warm, so it is going to be a sweater that I will be wearing a lot in winter to keep myself warm. And yeah, like the fuzziness is I like the look of the fuzziness as well, but those strands were a little bit frustrating when I was knitting with them. I guess now that they are knitted into the fabric, they're not flying around as much because they're just, you know, tightly incorporated into the stitches, but knitting with this yarn is a bit messy. So that was, I guess, the only downside to the whole experience. But yeah, that's my wild Posy. That was my experience of knitting with it, and I think I've mentioned everything that I wanted to say about this project. So let me move on to my second finished object. So this is a pair of socks. I guess nothing very spectacular, I guess a little bit of a boring color, but these are made from my Handspun yarn. So I was showing this yarn to you in my previous episode, and it was a fiber from World of Wool called Fireside, and I was showing you this yarn because it was very heavily overspun. I have spun this as an opposing 3-ply, which means that 2 of the singles were spun in the Z direction, the third single was spun in the S direction, and then you ply all 3 strands together in the S direction. But I've added a lot of twist onto the plying process, and this yarn ended up being heavily overspun, to the point that when I started knitting these socks, the fabric was going completely on a bias. It was quite ridiculous. So I decided to run this yarn through the wheel again in the opposite direction to take some of that twist away, and actually it worked out really nicely. So I managed to knit a pair of vanilla socks. The fabric is still going a little bit on a bias, although it actually could have something to do as well with how I was blocking these socks. I didn't arrange the sock nicely, I guess, maybe around the sock blocker. So if you look closely, you will see the knit stitches going a little bit on that side. But it's not anything crazy, I would say. And when I wear these socks, so I wore them once already, oops, and then I had to block them again to make them look nice for the podcast. They did not twist around my foot, so that's not a big problem. I think they will still be very wearable socks, but they ended up being really thin. I don't know if you will be able to see it on the camera, but they are almost see-through. I don't know if you can see my fingers inside. Can you see how see-through they are? You can actually see the light behind here. They're almost like stockings. When I put them on, like, you can actually see my foot, which is a bit funny. But yeah, I think I went a bit too crazy with how thin I spun. So even though they are a 3-ply yarn, it actually worked out to be like a light fingering weight. And these are just typical vanilla socks, 56 stitches, knit, cuff down. And yeah, so I just followed my usual recipe for vanilla socks, and I realized that the fabric was just quite gapey, quite opened. That's why you can like see my foot when I put them on. Because I think what I was supposed to do in this case is just to maybe add more stitches, so the fabric doesn't stretch as much on my foot. But it's okay. They will be, let's say, early autumn, late spring socks, just to have a little bit of breeze inside. But still, I am really happy with them anyway. So I know they will be getting a lot of wear, and I will report back on how they are wearing. I did mention before that I had a pair of socks spun from, or knitted from, my Handspun yarn, and they've been wearing really well. So I'm really hoping that these ones will last quite long as well. Although, as I said, they are really thin, so I wouldn't be surprised if they started to wear out at some point. But nevertheless, I still treat it as a successful spin, and yeah, I'm very happy with them. So not much more to say about them, and we might as well just move on to my whips. So at the moment I have 2 whips. The first one is a project that I'm working on for my partner. So I mentioned that before, that I wanted to knit him a vest, and this is it. I literally started like 2 days ago or something like that, so I only have the ribbing, and I just started the stockinette section on the body. This project is called Neat by, can't remember the designer's name, but I'll put it on the screen. And the construction is actually bottom up, and the construction is, it actually is supposed to be knit flat, but I really didn't want to do so much purling, so I decided to convert it to working around. So, you know, if you work flat and the pattern tells you to cast on an X number of stitches, I just decided to cast on twice the amount join in a round, and I will keep going in a round until I reach the split for the arm openings, and at that point I will start knitting flat, and then I will just follow each section as it is written. So I think that should work out. It's the first time I'm converting a flat design to work in a round, but I think that's what you're doing, right? You just, at least if you're working bottom up, it just seems to be much easier, at least in my head, to convert it. God knows, maybe when I get to the point of the armpits, it will start going downhill, but hopefully not. I think that should work out. So that's what I'm going to do. As I say, not much to say about it. I am knitting this in the Drops Lima yarn, which is a blend of wool and alpaca. I was talking about a similar blend of yarn in my previous episode where I was talking about the Lenore cardigan, which grew immensely because of the alpaca, I believe. But this blend is exactly the same blend actually. So the Lenore was knitted in the Drops Flora, which is 65% wool, 35% alpaca. This is exactly the same blend. The only difference is that this is a DK weight. The Drops Flora is a fingering weight. But I believe the yarn will potentially behave in exactly the same way. So I need to be mindful, and I need to make sure that I'm not knitting this ridiculously long. Now, I did swatch, and I made a bigger swatch just to see what happens after I wash it. To my surprise, the row gauge did not change at all. So the row gauge was 27 stitches, which is actually what the pattern is calling for. So this is the first time in my life that I'm on the gauge when it comes to the row gauge. But after washing the swatch, it didn't change. But I think I will still knit it shorter. And the way I'm justifying my thinking is that if I finish a garment, obviously there's going to be a lot of fabric, so it is going to be a bit heavy. And I'm thinking it probably will stretch under its own weight. So if you think about a swatch, so I made it maybe like this big. I don't know where it is, but I made it bigger than normally. But it's still just, a small square, and it is not heavy, so I feel like it just doesn't pull the fabric as much. But I think if you add more to it, it probably will start stretching. So maybe what I'm going to do is I will knit the body for like a few inches, and then I'm going to wash it and see what happens. Yeah, but I am not particularly worried. I think it's going to be fine. Yeah, but there's going to be a lot of knitting because this is just going to be plain stockinette for miles and miles. But yeah, let me show you my second whip that I have. It's I guess a little bit unusual for me to have two whips going on at the same time because I am very much a monogamous knitter. But this project is going to be a very long-standing project that will take me months to complete. And what I would like to knit is a blanket. So, winter is coming, it's getting colder and colder, and you just want to get cozy on the sofa, and just, sometimes it can get really chilly, so I would like to wrap myself in a blanket. And I've realized I have no knitted blanket, so it's time to make one for myself. I was thinking about lots of different versions, and I had lots of different ideas, but this is going to sound silly, but I have a bit of a stash, let's say. I have quite a lot of yarn, and I have many sweater quantities, which almost you could translate to also like blanket quantities. But for some reason, I don't want to waste this yarn on the blanket. Like, I want to knit a sweater from those quantities. So for some reason, like, I don't want to waste this yarn on the blanket. So I started looking into other ideas that I could use for other yarn. And then I remembered that I had the Coziest memory blanket pattern in my favorites for a very long time. And I have seen people knitting on this many times in various podcasts. And I always thought it was such a fun idea. But then I forgot about it. So now I figured it's the time to cast it on. So I've got a bag of scraps, which I keep here in this wool warehouse bag. I think I've got more scraps somewhere else, so I just need to dig into them. So I believe I have plenty of yarn to start playing around, and obviously as I knit more and more, I will keep collecting more scraps. So I think this is a great design, a great pattern to just get rid of those scraps and also not waste the sweater quantities of yarn on a blanket. So what I've got here is just one square and a bit. This shape, I guess, looks a bit weird, but essentially the way you're knitting is you cast on the stitches. Actually, maybe let me take a step back, because the idea behind this project is to knit the Coziest memory blanket, but actually I kind of made some modifications, and they're not like my invention. Full credit goes to Ina Knit, I believe. She's a podcaster. I've never seen her podcast, but when I went to the Coziest Memories blanket page and when I looked at projects of other people, I saw one person who added those frames to those squares. And I thought it was a brilliant idea, because when it comes to this project, if you are really using scraps in various colors, it can really get a little bit crazy. And I'm not entirely sure whether I like fully love it. So I figured, and actually by looking at that project page, I realized that by adding a frame to each of those squares, it almost like you are calming the whole project down a little bit, you know? At least there is one constant going on around, and yeah, it just adds a really nice frame. I'll insert a picture of the project that I'm talking about. I think that person used white yarn as a frame. I'm using black. But I think that was a really great idea. And this person added a link to, or mentioned the podcaster who did those frames. So I went to that podcaster's video, watched it, and I followed the instructions that she had. But the instructions that she had were not only for the frames, but also for the square itself. So the Coziest memory blanket, I think the decreases here that create this line are slightly different. So if you look at the original, the squares actually are slightly different in the middle, but I really liked that line here. And you create it by, once you get to the point where you want to start decreasing, you are slipping 2 stitches together as if to knit, then you knit one, and then you pass over those 2 slipped stitches onto the other needle back. So that's how you create this line here, which I think looks quite pretty. So this is how I'm going to knit the whole blanket. Now, when you are decreasing, then obviously this bit here, which looks like just a straight line, eventually will start kind of curving, and it will just turn into a square like this one here. The edge here doesn't look very neat. I think it's because like I had to cast on some stitches and it just doesn't look very nice. But I think what I'm going to do at the very end, when I'm finished with this whole blanket, I will probably just take the crochet hook, pick up some stitches, and just do like a crocheted edging just to make it nice and neat. I want to be a little bit methodical about which colors I'm choosing, so I don't want this to be like completely crazy. I want these colors kind of have a bit of a flow, I think. So I will be a little bit more mindful which colors I'm putting together. So here I've got, this yarn is Yeoman yarn in the color Burn Soul Clay. I used to knit a sweater, not a cardigan, from this yarn, but it didn't fit. It was the LYS by Andrea Mowry, but it ended up being way too small, so I ripped back, and for some reason I had like this tiny ball of this yarn, like separate to what I ripped back from. I don't know why, but anyway, like I used this as the first square, and then here I've got something that's more like a, I don't know, like a rusty color. This is, I think, Drops Fable. But I think I need to rip back. So basically what I did, when it comes to the frame here, I will need quite a lot of this yarn because it's going to run across the whole of the blanket. So I looked in my stash. I didn't want to waste any sweater quantity of my good yarn, but I still have plenty of this very old acrylic yarn that was sitting in my stash forever. I was meant to get rid of it, but never got around to it. And I figured, you know what, it's just the blanket, and at the end of the day, yes, acrylic is not good because it's plastic. We should be a little bit more mindful about, you know, using plastic. But because it was already sitting in my stash, I feel like it's actually better than like throwing it away or whatever. I'm actually making use of it. So I'm using this acrylic yarn as the frame, but it's a DK weight. Whereas most of my yarn in my stash, the little scraps that I have here, they're actually fingering weight. So I think it's just not working out very well, and it's not working out very well for the needles that I'm using. So I'm using 3.5 millimeters, and the reason why I'm using 3.5 is because I have 2 sets of tips of 3.5s for my Knit Pros cables. And 3.5 millimeters is actually one of those sizes that I use quite a lot in my knitting, so I didn't want to have a project on these needles while I actually need them to work on something else, because this is going to sit on my needles for a very long time. So yeah, so I figured 3.5 is what I want to go for, but I don't think it creates a nice fabric for a fingering weight yarn. So it looks fine on the DK weight, but the middle part here is fingering weight, and it's quite gapey. You can see through it, which I don't think is great. So I think I'm going to rip back, and I'm going to hold all those fingering weight scraps double to make it a little bit more dense and nice and squishy and cozy. So this is going to be ripped back. Although I could change the needle size, to be honest, because to be honest, I don't. It's not like this is going to sit on the needles. In my head, I was thinking, yeah, I'm going to knit it for months, and the needles are going to be busy. They're not, because actually each square is made separately. So after you're done with the square, the needles are free, and then you pick up the stitches to add another square. So actually, it's not a big problem, but. When I look at the fabric on the DK weight on 3.5 millimeters, I think this is what I would like to have across the whole blanket. So that's probably what I'm going to do. And what else about this project? I think that's it. Yeah. So I'm not sure how often I'm going to be showing this to you. Maybe if I add more squares, I'll do a little check-in on my future episodes just to see how it's going. But the idea that I have is I would like to knit 1 square a day, which is totally doable because it takes like, I don't know, half an hour to knit a square. It's a very quick knit, so I think it's going to be fun. I don't know how big I'm going to make it. I'll see how it grows. I'll make decisions as I go. But yeah, stay tuned. I will definitely show you the progress in the future. So that was all the knitting that I wanted to show you, and now let's move on to some spinning. So my spinning at the moment is very much evolving around my spin for the Shifty sweater. So that's spinning the Rayland fiber, and recently I have also decided to start actively thinking about the contrasting colors that I would like to put on this sweater. And very spontaneously I decided to dye some fiber a few weeks ago, and then I started spinning it immediately. And I've got this yarn here. It's still a bit damp, so I don't have it in a skein, but I can but I can hang it up just to kind of show you what it looks like, more or less. Yeah, it's like a navy and reddish kind of color. And the fiber that I used for this spin is Polworth. So this is the first time I'm working with Polworth. Let me just get it closer to show you the colors. Now, I don't know if you're going to see at this point that my plying has not been great. There are areas where the yarn is perfectly plied. It looks lovely. In some other areas, it's very underplied. Like in here, for some reason, there is like a whole section that just looks rubbish. I don't know why it's so inconsistent. I think I was watching TV while I was plying and I was getting a bit bored, so I think I didn't pay attention to what I was doing. So I'm gonna have to run it through the wheel again and this time pay attention, because obviously I don't want to add more twists to the sections that look perfectly fine, but I need to add a bit of spin to all the underplied stuff that just looks horrible. But yeah, it was a very interesting experience to work with Polworth. Actually, it's very interesting to look at it even now, because as it's drying, I think it has something to do with the crim of the fiber, because it just kind of like, it just becomes a bit curly. You can see it here. It just does it by itself. It just becomes like a bit wavy here. So it's not because it was like tied or it was like hanging over something. It just does that to itself. Very interesting. As I said, this was the first time I was working with Polworth, and it was an interesting experience. So before I started spinning, I looked into the, is it called Fleece and Fiber Source Book? I'll put the book on the screen here. So I got this book months ago when I started spinning. And whenever I start working with the new to me fiber, I do a little bit of reading just to have an understanding of what I could expect from the process and the finished yarn. And it very much fell into what the book said. So one of the things it said is essentially Polworth is fairly similar to merino. It feels very soft. It feels as soft as merino, I would say. But the staple length is just a little bit longer, so it was a little bit easier to work with. They even mentioned in the book that it's a very good fiber for like beginner spinners who would like to get introduced to like finer fiber, because merino can be a little bit tricky. It's quite slippery and it's very easy to break it, whereas this one, it just felt like it didn't break as much. However, I feel like there is more drape to the Polworth yarn. It's still a little bit tricky for me to say because it is still damp, so it is still going to change a little bit. But what I can already see as well is that the fiber, the final yarn, it puffs up quite a lot. And this was what the book mentioned as well. They did say that you should spin just a little bit thinner than you think you should, because it is going to puff up and bloom, and it is true for this yarn. But I think I ended up with what I really was aiming for, so the overall thickness should be very similar to my Rayland fiber, which I've got here. So if you haven't been here before, this is the Rayland fiber that I've been spinning, and it's going to be the background color for my Shifty sweater, and I think this is going to be the first contrasting color, I think. Because I'm still not 100% sure whether I want to have that much contrast, but I guess I will make my decision when I start knitting and swatching. So we'll see. But the overall experience of working with Polworth was very, very pleasant. Dyeing the fiber was fairly easy as well. It did not felt it in one place, but that was purely because I forgot about the fiber. But I think if I forgot about merino, that would be completely felted. So I think it just was a little bit more forgiving to the dyeing process. And yeah, the process of spinning this was quite pleasant as well. So I would choose this over merino in the future. Honestly, like, I keep saying so many, it's not like I'm saying bad things about merino, but it's, I don't know, like merino is great, and if I was to buy commercial yarn, I would often choose merino because it's nice and soft and squishy. But when it comes to fiber for spinning, merino is getting so low on like my list, you know, it's getting lower and lower. There are so many better fibers for spinning, for sure. So Polworth is getting quite high on my list. Very, very pleasant yarn that I ended up with. But yeah, we'll see what the color is going to look like in the end when I add a little bit more twist, because right now I can see some places where it doesn't look great. But if I add a bit more twist, it should be a nice yarn. So that was my spin. I had some leftovers. Did I say it was a 3-ply? I probably didn't. It is a 3-ply yarn, and I did a fractal spin. So I divided this fiber into 3 pieces lengthwise. The first one I spun end to end. The second one I divided into 2 more strips, and the third one I can't remember how many bits I ended up with. It could have been around 5. And then I just plied everything together. And obviously I ended up with some leftovers, so I like to do chain plying from the leftovers. So I just ended up with this little skein. I had 2 bobbins left with some fiber on it, and just did a chain ply from both of them, and I think that's a pretty lovely color, and it's going to go on my blanket, then it's not going to be wasted. So that's pretty much probably what I will be doing with my leftovers. I will just chain ply them and put on the blanket. And oh gosh, I think with that, I think we've reached the end. I don't know how long I've been talking, but hopefully not for over an hour. Fingers crossed. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you did, I would love it if you could give the thumbs up or subscribe to the channel. It definitely helps with growing. So I will see you next time. Bye!